Hello, everyone, and welcome, and happy Earth Day. I am Jenny Levine, Humanities and Adult Programming Coordinator for Durham County Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Ribbons of Color and Eno River Journal. This program is in celebration of the publication of the Eno River Association's first Eno River Journal in 20 years, Ribbons of Color Along the Eno River, the history of African Americans and people of color living on the Eno. This journal is available in the Durham County Library or may be purchased at your favorite local bookstore. This program is being recorded and will be available on the Durham County Library YouTube page. I will share the link when the video is ready. If you would like to join the mailing list email that I send out weekly highlighting humanities programs and programs that may be of interest to you, please let me know. I'll put my email in the chat. You'll also receive a feedback form via email where you can let us know what you thought of the program. You're encouraged to enter questions in the chat, and we will attend to them a bit later in the program. Now for introductions. Beverly Scarlett is the leading contributor to Ribbons of Color along the Eno. Her family has lived along the Eno for many generations, and she is a relative of Fanny Breeze, namesake of Fanny's Ford at Eno River State Park. She is retiring this month from her role as a district court judge in Orange County. Dr. Freddie Parker was born and reared in Hillsborough, North Carolina. He received the BA in History from North Carolina Central University in 1975, the MA in History from NCCU in 1977, and the PhD in American History from UNC Chapel Hill in 1987. He is currently Professor Emeritus and former Julius L. Chambers Endowed Professor of History at North Carolina Central University here in Durham. He taught African American, and African history at NCCU for 39 years. He is author of the books Running for Freedom, Slave Runaways in NC, 1775 to 1840, and Stealing a Little Freedom, Advertisements for Slave Runaways in NC, 1791 to 1840. He appeared on several PBS and BBC television specials. In 2013, Dr. Parker received the Christopher Crittenden Award for his career contributions to the historical profession in North Carolina. On January 31st, 2020, Dr. Parker was honored by Governor Roy Cooper for his exemplary service and invaluable contributions made to North Carolina's community and education culture. Jessica Sheffield is the Executive Director for the Eno River Association and will be moderating some of the discussion. Welcome to our guests, panelists, and now, Ms. Sheffield.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Earth Day to you. What a great day to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. I think I speak for all of us when I say thank you for having us. As Jenny said, I'm Jessica Sheffield. I'm the Executive Director at the Eno River Association based here in Durham, North Carolina. And I have the pleasure of taking just a few minutes at the top of the program hour to share an overview with you of the good work that we're doing in the neighborhood and in the Eno River watershed, and to tee up how we got from this work in land conservation to publishing a book, Ribbons of Color Along the Eno River. The Eno River Association is one of dozens of certified land trusts working across the country to ensure that land is preserved, stewarded, and that natural area access is expanded for the benefits of wildlife and plants and people. The events of the past pandemic year have certainly cast a bright light on our need for open spaces, walking trails, clean air, clean water, all vital components of our physical and mental health and wellness. It's essential, of course, for these outdoor spaces for recreation to be expanded, but also that they are accessible and feeling safe for everyone in our community. Now, the Eno River Association has been busy at work here in the Triangle since the mid-60s. You may be well steeped in what we do, but let me just tell you a little bit. The first efforts made by Eno River families and neighbors who would then become the association were to stop a dam from being built on the Eno River. The dam would have powered industry, would have flooded, the reservoir would have flooded acres of habitat and historic and cultural sites, as well as homes and woods and trails. We saw the creation there based on the success of that effort. We saw the forming of West Point on the Eno Durham City Park and the start of the Eno River State Park, with which many of you are familiar. We continue our work today in both Durham and Orange counties through which the Eno River flows, protecting the natural, historic, and cultural resources of the watershed. We do this with our busy 8-person staff, our very dedicated and talented 12-person volunteer board of directors, and countless, truly hundreds of volunteers who help us with our land acquisition efforts, our land stewardship work, our outdoor education programs, public events, and our advocacy work. We're doing this for the wildlife and the plants who live and pass through these lands, to preserve and maintain the historical and cultural sites, and for the more than 1 million human visitors that these properties are seeing every year, and to ensure that clean drinking water is available, both for those of you in Hillsborough who draw from the Eno, as well for the 1 million people downstream using Falls Lake for a drinking water source. We have protected over 7,400 acres of land. I've mentioned Eno River State Park and West Point on the Eno City Park. What you may not know is that we've helped create Occoneechee Mountain State Natural Area in Hillsborough, managed by the state park system, Penny's Bend, which is managed by the North Carolina Botanical Gardens, as well as Little River Regional Park, and our own Confluence Natural Area, a 200-acre beautiful preserve where the east and west forks of the Eno join to start the Eno River. It's a special place. I hope you can enjoy it. Now, we're busy with stewardship on these lands as well. We have only one part-time staff member dedicated to that effort, so we really do rely on you, our volunteers, to help ensure that trails are safe and clean and well-maintained, that the invasive species are removed, and that native plants are reinstated. Want to make sure our native wildlife have their native plant species on which to draw their nutrition. Now, we are working to conserve natural resources, protect our drinking water. We are all working towards climate change resilience, no pun intended, but that's a hot topic, and there's a lot of work to be done to meet the governor's Executive 80 order outlining the metrics and goals for our state's climate resiliency. We're also reinvigorating our land use and advocacy work right now to help urban sprawl in the Eno watershed. Our areas become much more urban than when the association was first formed, and we're trying to do that carefully and thoughtfully. So if that's of interest to you, I hope that we'll hear from you if you want to help us keep our ear to the ground on developments in the watershed. So this land conservation and land stewardship work is typical of any land trust around the country, but what makes Eno River Association really special and unique is our commitment to highlight and lift up and preserve also the cultural and the history of our watershed. We have people, right? It's not just about the land and the plants and animals. We have the people to preserve and their stories to uplift. And so the Eno has done this over time by providing a few different avenues for people in the community to share their history. And we have our annual wall calendar. Hopefully many of you have that hanging up next to you on your wall. We've been producing those for 51 years, a treasure trove of stories and photographs from folks' lives in the Eno Basin. We have a twice-year newsletter, monthly e-news, as well as these published intermittently since the 70s journals that we're here to talk about today. We are proud that these are produced by people of the community for the people of our community. The Eno journals tell the stories of communities in the area, stories in some cases from very long before the association was a thought in anyone's mind. We have some that are dedicated to the indigenous tribes along the Eno, to the river mills, to the Little River, to our founder, Margaret Nygaard, and so on. Our most recent journal, which we're talking about today, was published just this past February. It is called Ribbons of Color Along the Eno River, The History of African Americans and the People of Color Living on the Eno. I can tell you now that this number at the bottom is important, volume 10, number 1. We're already working on number 2. There's been such a tremendous response to this one that we're going to be able to bring you another one next year. As Jenny said, it is online, not only through our online store, but also in local bookstores. Now, 2 of the authors for whom we can credit this publication are here with us today. We'll be starting with Judge Scarlett my friend Beverly over the last year. One of the first things that I was told when I came on as director of the Eno River Association a year and a half ago was that there was a journal in the works, and it had been in the works in people's minds and starting to be written on pieces of paper around town for the last 20 years. So here we are today to celebrate it with you. Now, Beverly is a local historian, and if I may say, it seems like a self-taught genealogy expert as you've traced your family tree through all the resources that you have in Hillsborough. Now, it's just been a great connection to make with her. We've been learning how people's paths are intertwined with our futures and current times, and there's just a lot to talk about here as we dig into the stories. Everybody has a story about the Eno River. Anybody I talk to and tell them where I work and what I work for, they want to tell me their Eno story. So we're going to hear from some of those today. Beverly, I don't know if you want to start with any of your readings, but I know we want to make sure that we talk about your family member, Christmas Scarlett. I wasn't sure if that was the essay you wanted to read, but this journal has been in the works a while, and I'm just glad to be able to celebrate it with you today.
Yes, thanks so much, Jessica. I will start by saying that unfortunately, but also fortunately, this has been a project that's been in the works for some time. When I was first approached, I was a new mom, and then life did what life does, and I'm busy trying to work, be a wife, raise a child, and the next thing I know, so many years have gone by. As unfortunate as COVID has been with our breaking the court system due to COVID, I had some time to just start writing, and once I started, it flowed. And you're right, I'm going to be reading today from the section on Levi Christmas Scarlett, who is my great-grandfather and who actually was enslaved and ended up being a landowner along the Eno River. Bathsheba Scarlett, enslaved, was raised along the Eno River on the plantation of John Scarlett, son of Stephen Scarlett. John was the father of 3 daughters, Mariah, Delilah, and Nancy, also known as Alice. Mariah and Delilah did not marry and lived in a home on their father's land. Mariah and Delilah reached adulthood, continuing to live on their father's land, overlooking the Eno pretty much as my father had described. The women operated a farm and possessed a little more than $2,000 in personal property. As the story goes, Levi Christmas Scarlett, was owned by Mariah and Delilah. He was 9 when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Abraham Lincoln. Mariah and Delilah did not want Christmas to leave their plantation, so they made an agreement with him. They promised to give him their land should he remain on the plantation to care for them. I am aware that the 6th United States Colored Infantry Regiment witnessed the surrender at Bennett Farm. This was an African-American unit of the Union Army. Responding to the call of Frederick Douglass, African-American men quickly joined the ranks of the Union Army following President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Believing they would assist in achieving civil rights for all people of color, the men fought with valor in the Richmond-Petersburg campaign, the attack on Fort Fisher, and the Battle of Wilmington and the Carolinas campaign. I would like to believe Christmas walked the short distance along the Eno River to see men who looked like him, adorned in uniform and beaming with pride. The surrender at Bennett Farm marked a special place in the history of the United States and a special place in the life of Levi Christmas Scarlett, a newly freed 12-year-old African-American man. Levi was no longer property. He was now a person. And so I'm very happy to have with me today a longtime friend and I'm now learning distant family member, Dr. Freddie Parker. I remember as a child in Hillsborough, everybody would talk about Freddie Parker, Freddie Parker. And I'm a little younger than Dr. Parker, so I knew Freddie Parker before I ever saw Dr. Freddie Parker. So now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Parker to tell us a little bit more about what was going on during these times, so we'll have better context of place, time, and just the environment. Dr. Parker.
Thank you, Beverly. Thank you also, Jessica and Jenny. It is really good to be here with you this afternoon. In recent days, I think that it's always important to understand that yesterday lives in today, that it is difficult to understand where we are today without understanding what happened 140 years ago, what happened 150 years ago. So these connections, this nexus between yesterday and today is what I really try to impress upon my students in their quest to understand yesterday. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to talk about dead people, and that's what historians do for the most part, unless we can allow the lives of those dead people to help us today. And so what can we gain from those who lived in 1865 and those who died in 1865? And 1865, you can imagine an individual who had been enslaved for 25 years, 40 years, knowing that their grandparents and parents and uncles and aunts had been enslaved. The problem was that's all they knew, for the most part, was enslavement. And we can never forget that right here in North Carolina, in 1865, there were also 30,000 free blacks living here in the state. Across the United States, there were 500,000 free blacks. So when we talk about the enslavement of Black people, we also have to understand that there is a long history of Black freedom with free Black people, and they made a tremendous impact. Frederick Douglass was a free man, even though he was born a slave. But so many people impacted the nation in so many ways. And so those 30,000 Black people who lived in North Carolina in 1865 wanted what everybody else wanted. Those people who became free in 1865 wanted what everybody else wanted. And I talk about some of those things. They wanted liberty, justice, the right to vote. They wanted a place to stay. They wanted a job. They wanted an education. And so the Jubilee that they experienced in 1865 brought them to that, brought them to this quest to enjoy all of the liberties that everybody else experienced. But you have to also understand that there were also hundreds of thousands of whites in North Carolina who did not want to see that become a reality. And so I always talk about what I call deconstruction and reconstruction. Reconstruction could really never take place in North Carolina because they couldn't deconstruct the past. It was almost impossible for reconstruction to take place because of this desire not to deconstruct a past, to hold on to a past. Very difficult for people who had enslaved people for hundreds of years to let them go. Imagine owning 100 people on January 1st, 1865. And now in June of 1865, that has completely collapsed. And folks were not about the business of letting that go. And so as it turns out, we know that organizations emerged, just day-to-day abuses of people who were standing at the crossroads. by standing at the crossroads, I'm saying in June of 1865, I've been with this master and this mistress for 40 years. Where do I go? What do I do? What do I do? Do I go north? Do I go east? Do I go west? Do I leave the country? What do I do? People did all of that. They left the country, they went north, they went to Canada. But for the most part, most of those individuals who lived, the 4 million, nearly 4 million who lived in the United States South, remained in the South. And we do, of course, have waves of migration that took place in the 1870s, 1890s, and after that. But for the most part, they had to deal with the daily activities of people who were trying to ensure that they remained in a place where they were before 1865. The emergence of the Ku Klux Klan in 1866, the emergence of the Knights of White Camellia in 1867, and other atrocity or racial terror organizations wreaked havoc on the population that had just been emancipated. The Freedmen's Bureau, which was created in 1865, looked at what was happening in this regard and began keeping records. And they entitled these records Outrages of Whites Against Blacks. And you can actually go online and look at those outrages. It is incredible that Daniel Blue in 1866 in Moore County, for example, had to experience a mob just coming into his house. And right down to the present time, we don't know why they selected his house, but they killed him, they killed his pregnant wife, and they killed all 5 of his children. A little baby crawling on the floor. They even took the heel of their shoe and kicked his brains out. And these kinds of stories emerged just on a daily basis, even before the Ku Klux Klan was established. Right there in Orange County, we know at least 5 Black men were lynched by the Ku Klux Klan. We know the terror that took place in Alamance County. We know the killing of Wyatt Outlaw, the killing of Justice John David Stevens. It became so terrible that Congress in 1871 decided that they needed to haul in people to talk about these atrocities. And they had those hearings in Washington. And those hearings revealed that approximately 5,000 people, Black and white, had been killed in the South by the Ku Klux Klan between 1866 and 1871. But in the face of all of that, Blacks and whites formed this Republican Party that was about the business of securing rights for the newly emancipated slaves. As a matter of fact, we know about the 14th Amendment. Even before the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and the bills or the laws that really curtailed the activities of the Ku Klux Klan were the enforcement acts passed in 1870 and 1871 that in some cases suspended the writ of habeas corpus and did a great job sending troops into areas in North Carolina, Alamance County, Caswell County, into South Carolina, into Tennessee and other places where the Klan was most effective. And so the Klan died to some extent after 1871. But in face of all of that, we have to look at institutional and organizational formation by the newly emancipated slaves. They formed churches. These are the official churches because before 1865, Blacks were not allowed to even establish places of worship. So they worshiped with in North Carolina, law was passed, which said that before 1865, Blacks could not worship by themselves. A white person had to always be in the company of them. So They are now able to establish churches, fraternal organizations, and institutions that were designed to ward off those efforts by those groups to curtail their rights. I'll stop there and entertain any more questions that you might have.
I'm sorry, Dr. Parker, I'll just add, this is so interesting. I've been taking notes. I always learn something when I hear you. But in the process of writing Ribbons of Color, there became an issue as to when Mount Gilead, my church, actually formed. Of course, our oral history said that we were pre-Civil War. And of course, some of the researchers working with us who were white said, no, it was established such and such time, which was post-Civil War, of course. And I went on to explain, well, I know we had a brush arbor. I know before the brush arbor, we were meeting in the woods. So, you know, that's what enslaved people had to do. So for us, we had a church. You all just didn't know about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so it's interesting to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, it's referred to as the invisible institution. Albert Roberto wrote a book way back in 1965 describing this institution. From the very beginning, I'm talking about the 17th century, when laws were passed which would not allow Blacks to worship at all. I mean, the bottom line was that you were not brought here to worship a God. You were not brought here to do anything except labor for us. And so even when Blacks in the 1650s and the early 1660s tried to transition from their religion to Christianity, there were these laws which disallowed that. As a matter of fact, the origins of slavery, legalized slavery, which began in the early 1660s, said even if you became a Christian and you are of African descent, you still can be a slave, because there was this unwritten kind of law which said that one Christian may not enslave another Christian. But the exception was made in Virginia in 1660, in 1661 in Maryland, and in 1663 when North Carolina legalized the enslavement of people of African descent. It made it legal to actually enslave them even if they were a Christian. And so it wasn't very difficult for Africans to adapt to Christianity, because religions, no matter where they are around the world, are very similar. And so that transition, I won't say it was made easy, but the transition did happen. And we do know that by the 1730s and 40s, 1750s, with the Great Awakening, whites, especially in the North, began to accept Blacks into the congregation. But even in the North, we do know that the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, was born out of segregation. Blacks were attending the George Street Methodist Church there in Philadelphia in the 1780s. And because they could not go down and pray with their white brethren down front, and they had to be in the back or in the balcony, they just decided that we need to get rid of this. And it was then that they formed the Free African Society in 1787, which led to the AME Church in 1794. But that invisible institution existed all the time. In the woods, we have Wednesday night prayer service today as a carryover of the experience of enslaved people stealing away to worship whenever they could. And Wednesday night seemed to have been the most popular time to do that. But yes, indeed, when I said it became organized after 1865, it existed from the 17th century as an invisible institution, except for those free Blacks who were living in New York, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati, when they formed their own churches that grew out of the Methodist Church.
Well, that's interesting to hear you talk even more, because Ribbons of Color, in volume 1, we talk about Fanny Breeze, who was not only a midwife along the Eno River, delivering babies of all colors, white, African American, and Native American. She was also a member of Pleasant Green United Methodist Church, which sits right there on the Eno River. And so the oral history goes that she was allowed to attend because of her status being a midwife. And of course, she took her husband and her daughters with her, but they could only worship in the balcony. And Fanny was a lively worshiper, as you know, we can be. And as you talked to me about your parents starting a church, becoming holy rollers, you know, we can be lively, we can be noisy. And so that made some white people uncomfortable. And Fanny realized that. And so she wanted to worship the way she wanted to worship and wanted her family members to be able to worship. And so she went to the trustees at Pleasant Green United Methodist Church, and they were the ones that helped Mount Gilead achieve land so that we'd have a place to put that first brush arbor. And so we started the formal church outside of the invisible church, right where Mount Gilead sits now. And Fanny's oldest daughter married one of the trustees' deacon and the first call minister from membership in that church. And the oldest daughter, the husband, and their children are buried right there at Mount Gilead. And, you know, we have a very small church, about 10 members, but we still have service. So it's continued all these years.
Yeah. You know, the fact is that in the lives of Black Americans, the church has been and still is the central institution. And I tell people all the time, when you look around and in the final analysis, it is the only institution that Black folks own. I mean, you can even talk about your North Carolina Central University, your A&T, your Fayetteville State. You know, they don't own that. You know, that's owned by the people of North Carolina. So when you really look at it, that is the only institution. And so over the years, you know, that's been the meeting place. And that's why so many of those churches were bombed. You know, just take, for example, in 1963, during a 4 or 5 year period, 50 churches bombed in Birmingham, Alabama. Crosses burned on the lawns of churches because people understood that this was the institution in the lives of Black Americans. This is where they met. This is where they got their strength. This was centermost. It was the centerpiece of the Black church, of the Black community. And the thing that happened next was the emergence of those all Black high schools that grew out of segregation that came about in the 1920s and 30s. And so the Black church and those Black schools married, and they were responsible for our lives, without a doubt, from the 1930s all the way down to the 1960s. And of course, the church still is that institution. And so when you look at a Black leader from even before slavery ended, a Black leader was usually a Black preacher. Name me a Black leader, I will name you a Black preacher. And they had this, the one thing that they had to have in order to pull people in was the gift of oratory. It had to be able
Right.
to speak to people. And I think that when we look back on Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King or Jesse Jackson or Adam Clayton Powell or even individuals who were Muslims, I mean, still these ministers had to have this gift of Farrakhan, for example, the gift of oratory. Not a Christian, but he is a religious man. And so the church has been that institution in the lives of Black Americans.
Wow, that's fascinating. You also talked about some things that I won't get into, but he's already previewing Ribbons of Color volume number 2 when he talks about Wyatt Outlaw, when he talks about the education system. And so you all stay posted and be ready for volume 2 because you'll learn even more. Dr. Parker, without knowledge, has opened the door, so there's even more information to come. And so, Jessica, if there are questions, we're ready to entertain them.
Great. Well, and I just too wanted to make sure to say to Dr. Parker, thank you for the contribution to this version, to this volume of the journal. What you've told us in pages, if you have your book in front of you, 14, 15, and 16 is very important to setting that stage for us that these personal stories and the rest come from. Beverly just called you one day and said, hey, we're working on a Ribbons of Color and I need you to write a piece. How did it come about that you contributed to this? I know Beverly was talking to family members and perhaps you said your extended family as well. You've come to find out your extended family.
Yeah, when Beverly calls, I mean, you just have to answer. And Beverly and I don't know if she remembers this or not, but we actually, Mount Bright did an all-day program on different aspects of the Black community. Several years ago, I did a piece, you did a piece. I sat in amazement listening to what you were doing. And I think you may have listened to some of what I was doing. I don't know if you remember, but anyway, Beverly has asked me to do something before and maybe it didn't fall through, it failed through, I should say. And then when she asked me about doing this, I mean, didn't hesitate at all. You can make a contribution. I think that's, but I'm retired too, so, you know.
Well, I have learned it's hard to say no to Judge Scarlett. That's true. But did I hear that y'all had another personal connection that came out of the Miss Eliza story? Did I overhear in one of our last conversations that the Miss Eliza didn't take the mess?
We'll get into that more at a different time, but Mr. Parker knew Miss Eliza. Of course, I met her in her very late years of life, but that story in and of itself tells about the conflict just in Hillsborough, North Carolina. Most people look at Hillsborough as this nice, peaceful, quaint little town. I had a hard time convincing attorneys when I was a prosecutor many moons ago that Hillsborough wasn't always the Hillsborough that we know. And they were shocked to find out that my first 2 years of education was in separate and unequal schools. And it wasn't until I was going into the 3rd grade that the schools were integrated. And for me and my sisters, nobody had a conversation with us. You know, we knew something was different because my parents were talking in code, telephone conversations in code. And then all of a sudden, you know, you're going to be going to a new school. Okay, to me, that's a building. And so then I end up in the school where there aren't many people who look like me. I have gone from my father's church where everybody looked like me, a school where everybody looked like me, my mother's church, where everybody looked like me. Now, her extended family, there's much more color variation because she descends from indigenous Americans. But nobody had that conversation about what this is going to be about. And so Miss Liza's story is about her daughter engaging in civil rights protests. And, you know, some people were being arrested, and this particular daughter was going to be able to escape an arrest because somebody knew Miss Liza. And when Miss Liza found out, she grabbed that child by the hand and said, "You're going down there and you're going to do everything everybody else did." Not because of what am I looking for, but the sure fact that this was so important. Yeah, you're going to be a part of it, and you're not going to escape it just because of my status.
Yeah, I remember Miss Eliza very well, as a matter of fact.
So anything?
Yeah, Miss Eliza lived, she lived next door to my grandmother. As a matter of fact, they were actually born in the same year. So I knew her daughters, Doris and Ann. We were all in the band together at Central High School. I played drums, and they were majorettes. So we would cross the state, playing, marching, you know, in different towns, cities across the state. So I knew the family very well. And the date that you referred to in terms of that arrest was in April of 1969. I know because I was one of those who was arrested for demonstrating without a permit. Mr. Julius Chambers and Stein and Ferguson actually served as our attorneys. We lost the case, but on appeal, it was actually thrown out, or whatever happens legally, Beverly. But we didn't have to go to jail. We didn't have to pull any time. We got into good trouble back in 1969. Those were some turbulent times, beginning in the early 1960s, and surely by the time we get to 1967, 68, 69, we are in the process of trying to desegregate education, the education system in Orange County. And we were successful in doing so by the summer of 1968.
I'm just looking here in the chat, and so there are lots of stories that could be told along the Eno River. To be perfectly honest, I had to sort of pick and choose which stories I would put into volume 1 and volume 2, because I could talk forever about living on the Eno River. Yeah. But I will tell you all this, that Levi was in fact emancipated. He was, in fact, allowed to continue to live on the plantation when the Scarlett sisters, well, actually, when Mariah died, she gave a life estate to Delilah. Delilah actually immediately deeded the land over to Levi. And I found something in the state archives that I've got to go back and hunt down, but it looks like Delilah may have gotten in trouble legally for doing that without resigning as the executor of her sister's will. But she has some kind of sanction there. I've got to figure out what it was. But at the end of the day, someone whose mother was purchased at the age of 16 months old ended up with, one count I got was 153 more or less acres. Then another count I got roughly 200 acres of land along the Eno. And you say, how can there be about 47 acre difference? Well, when you're talking about links and chains, and I'm somebody that needs a more modern way of tracking property. There is some overlap, and I do know a couple of the deeds included my great grandfather and the uncle of Mariah and Delilah. So I have some more tweaking of that to do. But this young man ends up owning property, and that's the property that I grew up on, I raised my daughter on. And to date, I've counted 7 Scarlett generations having been raised at that very site.
Wow.
Another question deals with, and Dr. Parker, this is going to be more you than me, colonies that were planned to allow free Blacks to own land. I'm presuming that's here in the United States, but I will tell you part of what came out of Mount Gilead was the missionary department participated in the lot carry convention. I grew up with my mom doing all this lot carry stuff, and I kind of knew what it was about, but it wasn't until honestly like a month ago that I really understood what the lot carry convention was about. And lot carry was one of those missionary turned preacher orators, as Dr. Parker said, that actually went to Liberia to start a colony, and he planted a church. So if newly freed slaves didn't want to stay in the United States, they could go to Liberia. And so I just sewed up a bunch of little girls' dresses and sent to Liberia 2 weeks ago, because it's just a powerful thing that somebody could leave everything that they know, go to somewhere they honestly don't know. Okay, your ancestors came from Africa. What do I know about Africa? I've never been to Africa. But he went and he actually started a colony there. And unfortunately, in doing his missionary work, he also lost his life. But that church just literally celebrated their 200-year anniversary this year.
Oh, wow. This is a great question here. And, you know, one of the things that we probably don't talk about enough in our efforts to understand why Reconstruction was a failure, that period between 1865 and 1877, a period where the so-called radical Republicans were trying to ensure that the Blacks had their rights. One of the problems was that the Civil War itself was not fought to bring slavery to an end. President Lincoln himself said that many times. If the war had been fought from the very inception to end slavery, then the lives of African Americans would have been much, much better, because a process would have been put in place for the transition from slavery to freedom. In other words, if in the late 1850s, state officials and surely federal officials had gotten together and said, we are going to end slavery at X date, but we can't end it until we put some things in place, some scenarios, some processes in place. What about where they will live? What about a home? What about an education? When the Civil War ended and slavery ended abruptly, where do we go from here? Had it been planned over a 5 or 6 or 8 or 10-year period, then in 1865, when it came to an end, hopefully without war, let's just say without war, then the lives of African Americans would have been altogether different. And that brings me to the question from Joe, I guess it is Joe Lyles. And that's a very good question, because the federal government tried several times to make that transition a bit easier. And how do you make it easier? You can give people the right to vote. You can give people the right to access to public accommodations. But if you don't give them an infrastructure or put an infrastructure in place that supports them economically, then they are doomed to failure. I mean, what sense does it make to have a right to go into an establishment with whites, but I have nowhere to live? You know, I have no money, I have no means of making a living. And so 3 experiments were actually tried. I talk about this in the article. There was the Port Royal experiment in South Carolina in 1861. The Freedmen's Colony actually on Roanoke Island, North Carolina in 1862. And then in 1865, there was a field order number 15 issued in 1865. The problem, and of course, all of these were designed to give the newly emancipated slaves land. Land can be the basis of freedom. It can be the basis of freedom. If I have 40 acres and a mule, that is a mule to help me cultivate those 40 acres, I now have a chance. But if I have nothing at all, I have very little chance. And so all of these experiments initiated by the federal government were designed. Imagine confiscating 400,000 acres of land and giving that land to the former slaves to pay for the fact that they had been enslaved all those years. Now, here's your land. I'm going to charge you a penny an acre when you can pay for it. The Army is going to give you your mule to cultivate the land. The fact is that happened, but it only happened for a few days, because as soon as President Lincoln died and Andrew Johnson became president, a Southerner, a sympathizer to Southerners, all of that was reversed. So the Port Royal experiment, oftentimes referred to as rehearsal for Reconstruction, that experiment died. The Roanoke Island colony died. It was decommissioned. And of course, what happened with all of the experiments never really saw the light of day. And that old idea about 40 acres and a mule, that was real. And imagine how life would be for Black Americans if this had happened on the front end. By front end, I mean, you've held people in legal slavery for more than 200 years. You end it and you just throw them to the wolves, rather than putting in place an economic infrastructure that would ensure their success. So, the ending of slavery and people being dispersed throughout the country, but primarily staying in the South, meant nothing, essentially, but doom for them. And so when we talk about, all of the problems that folks have today, we can trace it back to the institution of slavery.
I think that's a fabulous point, because one thing I didn't realize myself is that the whole concept of 40 acres and a mule only lasted for days. Because, as African Americans, people of color, we'll, throw that out there, and you hear people in protest say, well, where's my 40 acres and a mule? Yeah. We had no idea that only lasted for days.
Yeah,
days.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Joe asked that question, and he was the main illustrator for our book.
Oh, okay.
And so in your chapter, Joe did this illustration, and he also drew this wonderful one on 61 of Fanny Breeze, who we mentioned earlier. I just don't know that you're going to be able to see that.
Oh yeah, I can see it. I'm looking at it right now.
Joe was a mastermind behind the Eno Journal and the way it looks, and so I'm glad he's here. Hi, Joe.
Great, Joe. Thanks for that question.
And if I could just jump in, I wanted to say these two questions just really help exemplify what this journal is. Dr. Parker provides the context. There's some wonderful history, and then these amazing stories that I feel like Beverly and others, just reached out just in time to grab the stories from the people who told them, and she puts them on paper and they're brought to life. And so that's exactly what this is. So get a copy and all your questions will be answered. I want to know how you got connected with the other contributors. I also want to know what's going on in the cover photo. I kind of know what's going on, but you mentioned churches so much. So I was hoping one of you could speak about that a little bit.
So what's going on in the photo is an actual baptizing, I think from 2019 for Mount Gilead. There, the person with the towel around his neck is our pastor, Pastor Wilson. He's there at Mount Gilead, been there about 26, 27, 28 years. We stopped counting. My mother said before she died at an anniversary, he had 30 more years. So we just decided not to count anymore. And then that's his brother-in-law, who's a minister at another church, and they're baptizing a new convert. And so we did it at the traditional Mount Gilead site right there on Fuse Ford. And we have our little hole. And until 1967, baptizing happened there. I know that date because I was baptized in 68. And I couldn't be baptized in the river. And I still feel some kind of way about that. But all the churches in Durham had these new baptism pool right behind the pulpit. And so my parents were so excited. And the Union of Churches, of which our church belongs, had a convention. And so I got baptized inside at Moorhead Avenue Baptist Church in Durham. And I'm grateful for that. But I never got my river baptizing, and all of my cousins did.
I was baptized in the river. I was baptized in the river.
Even cousin Freddie got a river baptizing. I didn't. It
was muddy water too.
Yes, that's usually how it was. So that's our most recent one. The church is very small, and if we get anyone else to join, of course, I'll ask Pastor Wilson. He may or may not, because he's afraid of snakes, and no matter what I tell him, he's like, I don't know. So as to recruiting authors or contributors, I just sort of relied on my natural supports, kind of went through my email list, my phone list, and a lot of people I asked didn't commit. Others did, and it didn't happen. And I'm okay with that, because what I learned from that is writing really is an art. For me, it probably comes a little easier than it does for others. But even my sister, who lives right next door to me, I'm still waiting on her contribution. And it's almost been 18 months now, but I think I've decided I'm not going to get it. But, writing is an art, and it takes a lot of sacrifice. And so I was pretty much a pain in a when it came down to, okay, how much information can we get in a volume? And I started talking about this volume 2 before the association was ready to commit. But I'm proud that we have a volume 2 coming out. They did commit, it's coming out. It's going to talk about many of the things that Dr. Parker talked about today, including some of the freedom work of free people of color. And there's a story that's going to be in there about my mom's great uncle who was a free person of color. And you'll be shocked to find out what happened to him. So I'm not going to tell you. You're just going to have to wait to find out.
I can't wait.
Jenny, was that the greatest setup to close our session or what? It's like we planned it that way.
I think so. I feel like we rehearsed it. You guys were amazing. Thank you so much, Jessica, Judge Scarlett, Dr. Parker. Really appreciate your contributions. And I hope those of you watching will order your copy and read it, check it out from the library. It's fascinating. Thank you all. Any final words, Jessica? Any of you?
Oh, I just appreciate everyone's time and spending your lunch hour with us today. If you haven't read it, read it. We're going to start a little book club after the summer months to just have some more lunchtime chats about it. There'll be more opportunities for you to speak with the authors in the coming months as well as the world starts to open back up. So stay tuned to our website for more information about journal events. And again, thank you to our contributors who were here today, and Jenny for the invitation to join you on your history series.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Happy Earth Day. Bye-bye.